Start? Hi. Hope you guys are all doing well today. I'm a little bit nervous, so, just bear with me, okay? The last time I gave this talk, it was only 5 minutes. So hopefully I've expanded enough to tell you some things, but I want to keep some time for question and discussion at the end. So the first thing I want to tell you, my name's Brian, you know that already. I run a company called Small World News, and we started in 2005, but even before that with something called Indymedia, producing our own stories and using digital cameras. But from there, we decided we have to do something more. So in 2005, I went to Iraq to train journalists there, or actually to start a project, and then began working with journalists there. Since then, we've had an explosion in this thing called citizen journalism, right? We didn't call it citizen journalism 13 years ago. We just called it independent journalism or freelance journalism or internet journalism. It's funny to think now that we have YouTube and we have this explosion of content and social media, but we've been publishing video on the internet basically since it began, since 2000, so 13 years now. Now, if you know anything about coverage and war zones and the evolving climate for freelancers, you might know some of these guys. Can you just put the slides up? Yeah, just keep the slides. So I want to tell you I'm not one of these guys, okay? Don't worry. I'm not a crazy guy. I'm not trying to start a revolution. So we got that clear. What we started to do after 2005 is to do journalism training, and what's something which is called media development. Some people might have heard of it. I hadn't heard of it until someone said, oh, you're doing media development. Well, I don't know what that is, but okay. So how did we get here? From 2005 to 2011, the Arab Spring started, right? I was at the time working in Afghanistan, and I came back to find that there was a revolution in Tunisia, and now a revolution has started in Egypt. And actually was in the process of moving my family across the country to, and we stopped at my father-in-law's house, and I said to my family, look, we got to stop here for a couple of days because I need to do some work. And we set up a site called Alive in Egypt. And what that did was it took a thing that Google was doing called Speak to Tweet. Has anybody heard of Speak to Tweet? No. Yeah, Claudia knows. So Speak to Tweet was a project to create a phone system where you can call a phone number, leave a voicemail, and it will appear on Twitter. Now, sounds like a great plan, except most people in the world don't speak Arabic, and everyone in Egypt speaks Arabic. So Alive in Egypt was a project to organize 200 volunteer translators, and over the span of few days, a couple of weeks, we translated 700 calls from Egyptians, all with volunteers. You can see 370,000 page views, and this is a website that didn't exist, days before, right? And it was we saw this huge success. Then, of course, on February 18th, Mubarak conceded, and the traffic completely stopped. No one was interested in that news anymore. So we're thinking about what we were going to do next. And our plan was to go to Egypt and do what we've been doing, to train journalists to help build this new media in the face of the post-revolutionary period. But as happens, the Arab Spring continued, and new countries were in revolution. And anybody who's a freelancer knows that you go wherever the funder goes or wherever the contract is. So as we were looking for money to train journalists in Egypt, funders came to us and said, well, there's this problem in Libya, and we'd really think you should go there and start working with them because they have a greater need right now. I don't know what you guys knew about Libya. I mean, you're from Italy, a lot of you, so probably you knew more about Libya than I did, but this is what I knew about Libya. This crazy guy, Gaddafi in all of his different get-ups, right? Didn't know a lot, but again, when you're a freelancer or when you depend on contracts, you go where the funds are. So you're probably wondering, how did I get to Libya? Well, with Facebook, quite frankly. I knew this guy, Nasser, and he said, well, I know some other guys, and he introduced me to a Harvard professor who was an Egyptian and a Stanford professor who was a Libyan. So if you can imagine that these guys are professors in the United States, and yet they're encouraging revolution in their home country, right? So this guy, you know, Muhammad, he says, look, why don't you call my friend who's a professor in Cairo, and they'll pick you up at the airport and take you to Alexandria. And his family are Awlad Ali. And if you know anything about this area of the world, Awlad Ali are kind of Bedouin people that go from northern Egypt into all the way almost to Benghazi. And they don't understand this border, and they're always going back and forth, and accused a lot of smuggling and this kind of thing. So from there, they got me to Alexandria, and Sammy, sorry, I'm for, just lost my train of thought. Anyway, so sorry. So Sammy, invited me to Libya and arranged for the travel to come all the way from Alexandria to Benghazi. So there, what you need is you need to pack, you need your equipment. So to start a news agency, you just need 10 flip cameras and 10 mobile phones, a satellite modem just in case the internet's not working, because it wasn't in Benghazi at the time, and a couple of sat phones, and you're ready to go. You can fit it all in a carry-on luggage, And we thought, okay, gonna get to Libya, and it will be just like our work in Afghanistan. We'll train journalists, and fantastic, and there'll be a news agency. But that would be a very short talk, right? So it was about this time that I started wondering, what am I doing? Have I gotten myself in way over my head? Because if you've ever been to a border where there isn't a country anymore, it looks kind of like this. There's no one, there's no people. It seems almost like a ghost town. And you start to wonder, what am I doing? So about 14 hours later, we get to Benghazi, and we went straight to the media center. And we found that this is what journalists look like in Libya, right? And again, I'm wondering, what am I doing? I've been in Afghanistan, I've been in Iraq, I've had a lot of preparation, but I was not at all prepared for what we found in Libya. But it's okay, because we started talking to some people, and Sammy had introduced us to a guy named Seraj Zubi, and Seraj was taking us around, and he introduced us to our first fixer and translator, Marwan. Now, I knew Marwan must be working at the media center, and it must be a translator, because it says so on Facebook. Marwan started introducing us to people, and he was actually one of Libya's only rock stars before the revolution. So it's kind of a funny thing, and became a translator, and now he's gone back to being a rock star. He introduced me to another guy named Ahmed, and he knew Ahmed because Ahmed had been a music blogger before. Under Gaddafi's time, you can't report about politics, you can't report about social issues, but you can talk about music, right? You can critique, especially Western music, Arabic music. And, so Ahmed started, we sent them off, and, they started producing, and this is my colleague Louis. We spent the time just trying to meet other people and finding, more people. Because the first thing you have to do once you get there is you have to recruit staff, right? So we're in the recruiting phase. Unfortunately, revolutionaries have a tendency not to be happy about independent and free media. So Ahmed promptly got himself arrested. He's just out, and you can imagine just someone in a protest shooting a video, and some other guy with a gun comes and says, "What are you doing? You don't have this little media center badge, so come with us," right? And, we rushed over to the media center to explain and to work this out and say, look, we were invited by Libyans from actually one of the main opposition families. We've been very forward, telling people what we're doing. We're here to set up a news agency, right? And the difference is that this is what the media center looks like, right? You can imagine it's not particularly prone to accuracy, to independence. And it's not like the idea is to create propaganda, but it's sort of effectively what happens, right? People end up just reporting on themselves and their own issues, and they're not asking questions. And that's what we're there trying to create, is to say we have to ask questions. So we're talking to Mohammed Kablan and saying, look, like, Ahmed is a journalist, he's a Libyan, he's pro-revolution, You know, we are all pro-democracy here, so shouldn't we have a free media? And he says, well, look, you know, the problem is that Ahmed is a Libyan, and he doesn't have a British passport, he doesn't have an Italian passport, so we don't know exactly. I don't know Ahmed. You know, maybe if there's someone whose brother or father or uncle can verify for him and say that he's a good guy and he's not a Gaddafi guy and blah, 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 like this. You can imagine I'm really shocked. So I'm seeing Libyans who have British passports, who are working with Arabic media or British media coming and with their press pass and saying, hi, no problem. But if you're a Libyan from Libya, you're not allowed to be in the free press, right? So we start arguing, and eventually I remembered that Seraj Zubi's phone number was in the hallway. So I went and I called Seraj and I said, hey, can you come like help us sort this out, right? And at this time, you know, in the time while we're waiting for Seraj to arrive, you know, Marwan explains to Muhammad, look, Muhammad, you know me, and Ahmed and I, we went to high school together, and we've known each other for 10 years. Okay, it's fine. Clearly you're not a spy. And you start to wonder, like, okay, first of all, you don't understand how to have a free media. And second of all, you don't really seem to understand how to have good security practice. And remember, this is February or March 2011, right? Long before the revolution's finished. And I'm starting to wonder, are they really going to be able to be successful if this is the practice? You know, like, you know a guy, then it's okay. Because nobody who knows a guy is a spy or, you know, anything like this, right? So, eventually Seraj shows up. And he gives me a call and says, hey, I'm out in the hall. And I go out in the hall and I see this guy. But this is not Seraj Zubi. This is Seraj al-Alam. And that was about the time that I learned that the name Seraj is kind of like John or Muhammad or Stephen in a lot of other places. There's a lot of guys. And over the next few days, I met a lot of guys named Seraj. But I started talking to Seraj, and he's like, well, why are you here? What are you doing? And, you know, it said, well, we're hoping to train journalists and provide support to Libyans who want to learn to make media. And it turns out that Seraj was not in the media center because he was just in a meeting with 10 colleagues of his talking about how they wanted to make a documentary about what's happening in Libya, but they don't know where to start. So that's a good place to be, right? Because this is the problem, you know? This is what we see with citizen journalism, usually, right? It's a camera. I don't know if you guys remember this video, but it was one of the famous videos from Libya of these yellow helmeted mercenaries going door to door. And it turns out that one of the colleagues of Seraj actually had shot this video. But when you play it, it's like very much shaky, and you can tell that some people are fighting, but there's no story there, right? So this is the first thing that we try to talk about is how do you create a story? And you know, I happen to believe that, you know, news is a formula, and that storytelling often is a formula. And so formulas, they can be taught, right? You have a story, create a storyboard, you know, step by step. You know, these images tell a story, right? It's clear. She's hungry, she goes to buy some food, eats an apple, finishes, and she's feeling better. So that's what we try to start teaching the Libyans. How do we create a storyboard, right? So in this case, you know, it's any story you can think of in terms of shots. Again, you know, journalists we might not like to admit it to the world, but news is a formula. And if it's a formula, you can teach it like a recipe, like you have a cookbook, you can have a cookbook for journalism. I can't necessarily tell you how to find a good story or to find the right person to interview or pull out the really great story. I think that's a learned skill. You know, that's something you have to do by experience. But the technical part, you can learn it, right? So we sent them out to shoot their first stories. Just at this point, we just say, just conceive of a story, shoot 5 shots at least. And again, revolutionaries don't like journalists. So we sent 3 women out together, and they were interviewing 2 old men and a barber about what do you think about the revolution, what do you want the international community to come, you know, sort of simple things, and not in a military sensitive area, just on a street. And 6 guys pull up in a pickup truck and say, hey you, what are you doing? Shouldn't you're women, it's not safe, you need to go home and you need to be in the kitchen, or maybe you can go to the women's area at the Martyrs Square, but you shouldn't be doing journalism. And anyway, where's your press card? And give me your camera, and I'm going to delete your media. And again, you know, you start to wonder, can we fix this? But, you know, it might be surprised, but these women were a little bit shocked, as you can imagine. You know, they're thinking they are revolutionaries, they are anti-Gaddafi, and they get this kind of attitude from just 6 random men with guns. But they came back to class, and we continued. So once you know how to shoot a story in a sequence, then you have to talk about, well, how do you make a good shot, right? And so this is sort of thing of teaching basic composition, you know, like anybody who's watched television understands basic composition, but they don't know what it is that they understand, right? You don't know that, you don't sit and watch television and say, wide shot, close up, medium, long shot, detail shot. I mean, if you've studied film, you might, you know, it's a curse. Once you start doing video editing, it's hard to watch movies again. But once you just give people a basic direction, they can start to make it. They can start to learn pretty quickly. You know, it's just like this. You just sketch out some stuff. You know, I talk about putting the guy on the left and he looks to the right. And, you know, simple steps. Again, news is a formula. So from there, you know, once you get to editing, if you've already created a sequence, you know how to make a good shot. You're just learning how to assemble clips in a row, right? It's not very hard. So after 3 days, we graduated our first team with sort of basic filmmaking and video journalism skills, right? Now, while all this was happening, of course, remember we're in a war zone. And protesters and people of Libya are asking for a no-fly zone, and they're, you know, increasingly worried because, you know, Muammar Gaddafi's forces are coming closer and closer to Benghazi. And we know that once they get to Benghazi, the revolution is over. You know, they're just going to crush everything, and it's going to be finished. That's what we suspect. But then we get the no-fly zone. And it seems like everything is great until March 19th. There's a plane shot down over Benghazi, and somehow some of Gaddafi's troops have come in with tanks. And as we do, all of the journalists flee, right? It's what happens. When you don't have a security, you don't have a secure space, a safe space, you have to get out of town. And yet this is the moment when we need the journalists most, right? But, you know, a lot of Libyans were fleeing too, so it's not like we were the only guys. It creates kind of a refugee traffic jam. But at this moment, we start wondering. So Louis and I are on the back of a truck with these other journalists. 12 hours goes by. We can't get a phone call into our team. We don't get any emails or any information from them. 24 hours goes by, still nothing. And we've decided, okay, it was a good try. We trained some guys. They learned some skills. We've learned a lot about how to teach people in a very compressed time. You know, 3 days only. And yet we're teaching filmmaking, right? Because we couldn't go back, because that's what happens. And after 36 hours, they published 6 videos by themselves with no communication with us. They've shot, they've edited, they've assembled, they've posted it to YouTube. And that's when we knew, okay, success, right? We have set up a news agency, and from there they produced some 200 videos throughout the revolution. In fact, after just 6 weeks of being in existence, Foreign Policy says that Alive in Libya is one of the top 3 places President Obama should look for information about Libya. And, you know, the other guys here is Chris Chivers, who's a New York Times reporter and, like, very well known, has won awards, all of this. Enough Gaddafi, who's been a blogger about Libya forever. And then Alive in Libya, which a website that didn't exist 6 weeks earlier. So, you know, it can be done. You're probably wondering what happens next, right? What about next time? The Libyan revolution is 2 years old. Hasn't a lot changed? And I would say that it has. We're going increasingly mobile. So from there, you know, at Small World News, we started trying to figure out how do we create an app that people can use. And so we created this thing called Storymaker, which gives you the training in the app as well as guides and helps you to learn to shoot. Again, I think news is a formula. You know, if you don't agree with me there, I'll be happy to debate you, you know, during as a question and answer or after if it gets really heated. But for me, I believe that there is a formula and we can teach anybody to create good stories. You know, the question then becomes, will larger news agencies listen, or will citizen journalists and independent journalists start doing it themselves entirely, right? So with Storymaker, we taught people that we see these are the main concepts. People need to learn to be journalists. They need to be able to make content easily, and they need to be able to share it. With Storymaker, we've created an app that allows you to publish even if YouTube is blocked, right? So anybody can use it. It's very easy. It's very secure. And in the future, citizen journalists will create their own great-looking videos, and people will see them anywhere. That's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that we don't have this continuous cycle of content that has no quality, that has no story, that has no context, right? That's the hardest thing, honestly, about starting a news agency, is you need to be able to teach those skills, right? To teach people to tell a story. And I hope the next time we can create a news agency in just 8 hours instead of 8 days. And it's already starting. These are some girls in Indonesia, all with their mobile phones making stories, but just taking pictures. So what if we can teach them the steps to actually tell a story? That's all I have for you. Thanks. Questions? Comments? Critiques? Tell me that I know nothing about what I'm talking about and I'm destroying journalism. Please. Yeah.
I think as traditional journalists usually make a point about being objective. Is this in anyhow important in your concept?
I don't think anybody can be objective, quite frankly, and I think it creates terrible journalism when you try to be objective. In the best case. In the worst case, you have something like our national public radio, where there's a conflict in Gaza, and they say, we're going to have the foreign minister of Israel come and tell us a bunch of propaganda, and we're not going to critique him. And then we're going to have the foreign minister from Hamas come and tell us a bunch of propaganda, and we're not going to critique him. And in fact, we've taught the audience less. Now, I do think that you have to teach accuracy, right? And this is the thing that distinguished Alive in Libya from all of the sort of citizen journalism and revolutionary media was that these guys were English teachers before the war. They understand facts, they understand all this kind of stuff, and they wanted to be accurate. And that's what we said. Anybody who came on our team, the first thing we said is, look, we'll teach you some skills, but if you're going to keep working with us, you have to commit to accuracy, to facts, to get sources. I'm not telling you have to interview guys who are pro-Gaddafi, but if some soldier or some revolutionary comes and tells you, X, Y, or Z, you have to say, well, what's the evidence for X, Y, or Z? And try as best you can to find someone else who will say, yes, actually, we did just retake Ajdabia, rather than just some guys with propaganda. You hear a lot of things, and that's why accuracy is important. I don't know that anybody could have been objective in Benghazi. On the other hand, maybe it is objective if the entire city is afraid of being crushed by a dictator. They're not pro-Gaddafi generally. But there were some, I'm sure there are some people, even in Benghazi at that time, who were still supporting Gaddafi. But again, accuracy, I think, is the key thing to go for, right? If you say something, you have to be able to back it up.
A rather disturbing question. Who funded you, and why did you decide to go to Libya at that time in that very exact context, helping those people?
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, right, we started on our own with our own fundraising some 7 years before, and from there we started doing training and taking contracts. In the case of Libya, this organization called Access Now, gave us the initial funding, and then Avaz actually gave us some funding to buy some more cameras and another laptop for them. But then on the latter half of the project was basically funded by, we did training in Afghanistan actually, and someone paid us to do that, and we take some of the profits and we put it into supporting the Libyan project. So I'm always happy to answer that question. I think somebody who feels it's a disturbing question, that's the problem. Yeah. No, I think, look, I'm happy to take money from just about anyone to do stuff that I already wanted to do. If you come and say, can you go and do this other thing, and I'll give you, that's a hard question, right? And also, no one's ever critiqued our content. I think that there's something to be said for certain people want to fund certain things, even if they're not going to tell you what to say or what to write. But if you're already planning to do that project anyway, to me it's the same.
Which is your next project?
What's that?
Which is your next project?
On Saturday, I'm going to Zambia to train journalists from Zimbabwe with Storymaker. And then right now, there's some others. A partner organization is doing training in Iraq with the Storymaker.
You had someone to cover your back in case you were arrested, or in the recruitment you had someone from Gaddafi and suddenly you were pointed with a gun. I've been in Palestine-Israeli area on my own. And afterwards, I realized it was dangerous. But I try not to attract the attention. But you were going around and saying that we're building this, so of course everyone or a circle of people would know. What could you do at that time?
Well, so at the first part, I mean, at the beginning of our sort of 1 week, 10 days in Libya, there was, we were there at the invitation of Libyans, right? And everyone was protecting us and taking care of us as foreigners. And even for foreign journalists, they weren't having a problem, you know. But as I said, the Libyan journalists were having a lot of problems if they didn't stay kind of within the lines. You know, I also actually have this guy here who's going to feel very embarrassed. This is Haitham. He was actually helped us to get out of Benghazi on the 19th, and luckily for me, he happens to be available right now, so he came to meet. But no, you know, it's the reason that we left on the 19th with all the journalists is because we didn't have that backup, you know. And in fact, a couple of hours later, it turned out that everything was calm in Benghazi, and it became kind of a party, you know, and it would have been fine to go back. But at that point, we didn't have our own car and our own driver and all this stuff. We were doing things like at a very low cost, right? But I never felt sort of unsafe until that last moment, you know, when everybody felt unsafe. And no amount of security or protection would have, you know, stopped and made it better at that point.
When you're interviewing civilians in a war zone who are on the receiving end of government attacks, have any incidents come up where you've been sort of accused of enabling the opposition or giving more of a voice to opposition characters? And does that also sometimes damage the way that you might want to work with people that have a different view of a conflict or people that are on the other political side?
Yeah, so in Libya, you know, it was impossible to find people who were in the opposition, right? And I mean, who were pro-Gaddafi, right? Everybody was in the opposition that we could meet. And then, you know, because I'm not there working as a journalist, I'm there teaching journalism and trying to train journalists. You know, we always press people to try to find someone else and to think critically. But it's hard, you know, and I think that the best point at that time is to be honest about your limitations, right? And to say, look, this is one view. I mean, when we started the project in Iraq, we only had a couple of Sunni reporters who reported from Sunni neighborhoods. And we were very clear with the viewership, right? We said, look, these are some perspectives from Adamiyya and from Mansour and these areas. And in fact, the audience started to press us to be journalists, you know, and so then we hired some Shia reporters. And again, the Shia reporters reported from Shia neighborhoods, the Sunni reporters from Sunni neighborhoods. I don't feel that they were pro-Shia or pro-Sunni. They just were reporting what's happening in their neighborhood only. And with some stories we worked together to kind of construct a narrative from both sides. You know, and I mean, in the case of Iraq, in fact, the journalists never met each other. They worked independently, and they would mail tapes. This is in the time where we still had DV tapes. They were actually shipping tapes to us in the U.S. for the editing and assembling. But I do think it's a fair question. I think if you can achieve it, you know, it's good. It's much better to try to, you know, get multiple sides. But at that point, when people were getting arrested just for standing on the street with a video camera, it wasn't possible.
Hi. How consistent has been your work? I mean, what are the students doing now? Are they still working as a citizen journalist? Can they live from that? Or did they return to their jobs as teachers?
Yeah. So Libya is an interesting case. I mean, it turned out that during the revolution, you know, basically the economy stopped and nobody was going to work. The only jobs were like the very bare minimum, but a lot of people were working for free and doing this kind of thing, just doing revolutionary work, right? And after the revolution, we found that the majority of the guys that we worked with went back to being teachers or doing whatever they did before the revolution, you know? Usually I find myself training journalists and people who want to be journalists. I mean, Libya is sort of a special case, right? In Afghanistan, we're working with journalists from all different local news agencies, also setting up a video news service for one of the professional agencies. So I think what's interesting is that from people in the European and American side, they look at anybody who's a local and think of them as a citizen journalist. And that's really hard. And that's the thing that we're trying always to get people to understand is that just because they don't look like you and they don't speak your language and they're using a tiny camera doesn't mean they're not a journalist, right? It's their attitude. Do they want to have accuracy? Do they want to try to create a good story and a narrative? Or are they just trying to support one side or another side? And they're just sort of, are they witnesses? You know, are they creating like sort of testimonials or activist narratives? Or are they trying to create journalism? You know?
Is it possible to do this work as a woman?
I think it depends on you, you know? In a place like Libya, it might be difficult because, you know, there's a lot of intolerance, there's a lot of sort of judgments made. On the other hand, you know, when I was in Libya, I saw, you know, young women running around doing journalism, and some of them were trying to work to provide some training. There's going to be a number of people from Libya here this week who are working in Libya. You know, I don't know if any of the folks who were asked to give classes, but that's something that started to happen with journalists who'd been there for a long time, is that the locals would say, we have these guys who want to be journalism. Can you come and like give a talk and tell us how to do it? What they often found is that when they told them you have to be accurate and you have to be or objective, this kind of thing, is that the Libyans turned off, you know? But I think certainly if you are not scared and if you're confident, you can do it. There's not a limitation, you know. On the other hand, I'm a man, so I try to make sure that, you know, I'm really being honest about that. But I think in Libya it would be difficult. But in a country that was not an Islamic country or was not a really conservative country, sure, it should be possible. I mean, there's groups like, World Pulse, which works with a lot of like women journalists and training journalists. It's definitely possible. In Libya, maybe not.
We were speaking about accuracy, and well, I was wondering, during your teaching, did you have some kind of advice to give to the journalists you were training towards not kind of doing propaganda, and how did you actually advise them to do so? That was, I mean, it was probably one of the most important issues during your training, not to be kind of subjective, not to be too partial, putting facts together. How did you do that?
I mean, it's, you know, look, we had a special case of people, right? The majority of the trainers were highly educated if they could speak English fluently, if they could teach English, right? And I would advise anybody who wants to do a training in a foreign country, find English teachers because, you know, they know how to listen and they understand training and they're a lot more educated. But what you do need to tell them is when somebody tells you something, you can't just take it at face value. You know, if you ask a question like, you know, if someone comes and says, my brother was killed by, you know, Gaddafi forces. Well, how do you know? You know, like, tell us more. You know, is there somebody else who witnessed it? I mean, this is the easiest thing that you can do, right? It's follow-up, right? And it's remembering. Also, the other question is who benefits from this story, right? Is there somebody who's making money? Is there somebody who takes an advantage? You know, in Afghanistan, we find a lot that like people are not trying to hurt other family groups, other tribal groups, but they just expect that like those people aren't people. Like I had a good friend who told me a story about it was an aid worker, and they're working about counting people in an area to figure out what's the amount of aid that they need. And they came back with this number, and even without, being locals, they knew on the face of it that this number was about half too few. And they said, well, those guys aren't people. They're not our tribe, so we don't count them. You asked us to count the people. And sometimes there's just things that people, I don't think it's bias. I think or maybe it is bias, but it's not intentional. It's just what you've been conditioned or how you've been raised. You don't,
I wonder how you sort of navigate the space between journalism and activism, and whether it matters that there is a difference between the two. I mean, Avaz, for example, are often held up as citizen journalists, but there's a large level of activism in what they do as well. Do you see a difference between the two strands?
I think it's hard for someone to do activism and journalism at the same time. So sometimes, the easiest thing is to try to find people who are willing to accept that telling the truth and telling your own stories and creating a free media is political enough, right? That's incredibly radical in a lot of parts of the world. On the other hand, we also try to say that for us, somebody who goes to a protest or goes out of their house in the morning and finds themselves in front of news and taking a picture of it is an activist or a citizen journalist, right? But somebody who, in the morning they wake up and they get their camera and they plan to go and document the event so that people will see it, they're a journalist. They might not be a good journalist. They might be a horribly biased journalist. But, I don't hear anyone calling Sky News or Fox News or people who, will say these are not journalists, but they don't call them citizen journalists. They say that they're bad journalists or they're biased, so what's the difference?
I was wondering if you have any code of conduct that you suggest these people use, except for being accurate, obviously, trying to be as objective as possible. Is there any ethical implications that you do try to say? For example, if taking the video, would you take a video of the person who's in grief or in pain or that kind of issues?
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, so we've developed kind of our standards, which are pretty much similar to other journalists, about around ethics and when to take a video and this kind of thing. And now declaring that you're a journalist, I think is important. Again, unless you're trying to, I think if somebody's doing an investigative piece and knows they won't have access, then maybe it's okay. But generally, you should always ask first. You need to get consent before you start videotaping someone. Again, I don't think that you should be filming people who are in sort of a shocked state if you're taking advantage of them, right? So we talk about that a lot. Again, in the case of Libya, after 3 days, we, had to stop. The class should have been, usually we teach for 5 or 6 days. This was just a case where we found that we could do it in a really compressed time, and they started creating their own work.
What kind of security can you guarantee the students that you're teaching who then go on to film or conduct journalism in politically sensitive areas?
Well, first of all, we at that time we were telling people don't go to the front lines. In fact, all of the international reporters are at the front lines, so that story's already being told. The story that's not being told is what's happening in Benghazi, what's the situation now. I spent that number of days there working very closely with locals. And I didn't realize until several months later when I went back, I was having a conversation with Seraj al-Alam's father, and he said, I was like, it doesn't look like much has changed in the last 5 months since I was here. And he said, well, in fact, it wasn't that different before the revolution. There was no services. Things didn't really run. They kind of went on their own time. And that's a huge story, right? It totally changes our narrative of how we look at what happened in Libya if we understand a bigger picture of what happened before, other than just Gaddafi's a crazy guy and people had enough and they decided to have a revolution. Well, why did they have enough? What was going on the last 40 years? It's also one of the most educated countries in Africa and the Middle East, yet they didn't have services, they didn't have institutions. And in fact, the narrative after the revolution has been completely colored by that lack of knowledge, right? the foreign governments and Western countries who supported the revolution have said, well, we don't need to put much money into rebuilding Libya or effort because they're an oil country and they're rich and they can do it themselves. But if you understand that Libya is not that different from Afghanistan in the level of its civil society, government institutions, infrastructure, this kind of thing, you realize like they need a lot. Maybe they don't need capital, but they need intellectual capital, and they need support, and they need trainers, right? Like even now, we don't really see something that is a kind of fact-based, accurate media coming out of Libya, right? What Libyans are building.
But I'm really talking about sort of having inspired people to hone their journalistic skills, you as an organization. And, I mean, is there any responsibility that you've got after that point when they go using the skills that you've taught them, then they get arrested or worse, kidnapped, etc.? Do you have any sort of commitment of care to them?
It wouldn't really be possible. We're a small organization. It's, half a dozen people mostly work right now. And generally we're supporting people who are already working at news agencies, right? Like the subsequent work we've done in Libya has been training journalists working at TV stations or newspapers. And we're there to provide skills and advice, but they don't work for us. With the previous project, Alive in Baghdad, our first project, we were running the entire thing. And so then in that case, yeah, we were trying to figure out how to provide additional support, or also, our journalists, again, we always tell them, don't report on an unsafe story. And if a journalist says, I'm not feeling safe, that's the end of the talk. But if a journalist also brings a story and we don't feel safe, it's also the end of the story, right? We just kill it. Like, the guys in Iraq, over the period of, 2006 to 2008, during like kind of the height of the sectarian conflict, every single one of them lost at least one family member, if not, two or three. But none of them were ever killed on the job. We lost one freelancer who was killed, but again, not for his work with us because of previous, and we did a big investigation. We worked with the Committee to Protect Journalists and these guys also to like help us kind of investigate, and best that we could determine it was not related to the work. Again, since then, that's become really our mantra, is to tell people to, think twice and to understand the risk level and be ready to kill the story, you don't need to be a hero, right? If you get killed, that's the last story you're ever going to tell, right?
You seem to be focused on teaching video journalism. Why? Isn't it technically the hardest thing? Wouldn't it be easy to teach them, text blogging or something?
I'm a filmmaker, so I studied film. I didn't study journalism, right? Like I grew up teaching people to make videos. Actually, I got into this when I was 17 because the video of the play that I was in theater, and the documentation of the play that was for the class and parents and whatnot looked terrible. So basically, I went down to the department in charge and said, "This is awful. We can do a lot better." And they gave me a job, and then I started training other college students to do the documentation. So I've been doing training since, 15 or 16 years now. But I'm a filmmaker at heart, and I worry that actually the training and the things that we're trying to support for radio journalists and print journalists, photojournalists fail a little bit because we have a huge focus on filmmaking. I actually think it's a lot harder to be a good print reporter, quite frankly, because the camera does a lot of the work for you if you just know where to put it and how to like put people in the frame. Whereas, writing good copy is, I don't know how you can teach that without teaching it to be very rote, very like repetitive and sort of look like everything else. We had to write a 45,000 word curriculum for the Storymaker, and it was really difficult, and it's hard for me now to like read other people's writing because I'm like critiquing it in my head. But I don't think, I think maybe it's like a myth that filmmaking is the hardest thing,
I
want to ask about your experience with mobile reporting in Libya, because as far as I know, the Wall Street Journal organized training classes for reporters for reporting news by motorbike, but you established your news agency only for a few days. So how could you teach or you change your personal staff to record videos, take photos, and send text by mobile phones? And the second question is that I want to ask about your opinion about the rising of reporting news by mobile phones. Like I know in the recent news in the Boston bomb explosion, the two suspect image were recorded by a smartphone. So I want to ask you about your opinion about the importance of reporting news by mobile phone in some revolution or in the world. Is it necessary? Is it necessary or a great tool for journalists to report news in the world in the next coming time or in the near future?
I think that what we're learning is that the best camera is the one that you have with you, right? And to me, a camera is a camera is a camera. You know, it has technical limitations, right? And if you spend $10,000, you can capture things in different formats and in different times and with less light or more light. But if you have a mobile phone with a camera, you can still follow the basic technique of composition and creating sequences of shots and, you know, basic interview techniques. It's all the same. And I think that the difficult issue now is how do we sort all of the content? You know, YouTube gets, 80 hours of content every minute. 80 hours of video every minute is uploaded to YouTube. It's insane, right? There's no way you could process it all after it's already gotten up there. So we're trying to work on we think if we can get people using one tool, or if we can instead kind of get people to start using, what we're doing is you can publish your content wherever you want, but if you're using StoryMaker, we can also tell a website where to find your content. And I think that's a concept that should be more considered, right? Rather than creating a new social network, people should be thinking about how to curate at that point of production. There is also a risk of the speed of the journalism or the citizen journalism or the reporting that we get things wrong, and I think that's the big debate I've been hearing. But, people have mobile phones, right? I mean, is there anybody in the room who doesn't have a mobile phone with a camera? Okay, we have one person, right, out of however many. So 1%, or less. It's just become natural. So the question really for me is how do we get journalists to start creating better content so they're not dependent on citizens and get them to think that just because I don't have my Canon camera, I can't go tell the story. If you've got an iPhone or, an Android phone with a camera, you're shooting HD video. I mean, this is, right, like something this size is producing content that would have cost $10,000 just a few years ago, right? And also you can edit it. And like literally this is $100,000 worth of technology 10 years ago, right? It's crazy. But the future's here, right? So.
How long and how do you prepare yourself before going in the field?
It depends. Before I went to Iraq, I spent a year researching, but that was because I had a much harder time to get the funding. Now what we do is we try to talk to people who are there. We try to talk to people who've been there recently. We try to, we're reading the news and checking other experts who've been there. And we try to assess the general situation, but also to make sure that we have a welcoming from local people. I would not parachute in completely uninvited and try to say, hey, I'm here to help you, right? Like, if someone doesn't want me to help them, I'm not going to be able to accomplish anything.
You were talking about Indymedia, and I was wondering, are you still involved? And if you know anything about Indymedia Italia, which is closed so far, and I'd like to know if it will be working in the future.
I mean, I think so. So I have kind of a very sort of up and down relationship with Indymedia. I mean, I was involved in 2000, kind of at the earliest time, and helped start a couple of centers around the U.S. I think that what we've seen is that Indymedia was only focused on providing a platform in a lot of cases, right? And now that you have YouTube and you have blogging and you have blogging software that's free and easy to install, no one needed what Indymedia was offering. And so the question now is there a benefit still to Indymedia, right? And I think unless you need a brand or want to have a sort of organizing point to gather around, it's hard to say that there's a benefit from Indymedia at this point, right? I mean, I think it had its time. I know there's some centers that are still running. I mean, in the United States, it's pretty much non-existent, except for kind of a core of people. And, there was always a problem where a lot of folks who were involved with Indymedia, at least from my experience, were either professionals or up-and-coming journalists who wanted a platform to be able to make their career or wanted to be able to have a place they could put stories that were too sensitive or not objective enough for their day job. And then there was a lot of crazy people, quite frankly, like a lot of people talking about the government's poisoning the water and there's mind control drugs and all this kind of thing. And it's the risk of having a totally open publishing platform and not having standards and sort of saying, look, we don't have to play with everyone. It's like this kind of thing of like, so I would be organizing video teams when big events would happen, and every day somebody new would come ahead of the protest or the event, and they would want us to rehash every decision we'd made up to that point. And it's like, we can't all be part of everything. And I think there's still a place for Indymedia, like if it has a brand or if it has a sense of a relationship to the community. But otherwise, I don't think there's much that it's offering anymore.
Thank you, Brian. But the festival told me that the time is over. Okay. And compliments for the interesting talks.
Thank you. Thank you.